Bonjour tout le monde, welcome to another episode of the Point of No Return podcast, the show where we go behind the scenes to understand the secrets and strategies of the most interesting Canadian technology companies. On this week's show, I had the pleasure of speaking with Sophie Forest, managing partner at Brightspark Ventures, and Alan MacIntosh, founding partner at AgeTech Capital. It's a very special episode. As you'll see very quickly, we didn't really talk about technology. We didn't really talk about AgeTech Capital or Brightspark Ventures. We spoke about a subject that's near and dear to the three of us, which is TechAide and giving back to the community. For those of you that are not familiar, TechAide is an organization based in Montreal which supports Centraide, which really combats poverty and social exclusion. And Sophie and Alan are really leading the way with TechAide and trying to rally the entire technology community to have this central purpose when it comes to social responsibility and notably giving back to Centraide via TechAide. So we really dove into TechAide's founding, its mission, why it's important to give back. Of course, we talked about the technology sector, its current, I want to say, zeitgeist, where we are today at the beginning of 2023, and the purpose of, while we're all here, of trying to give back a little bit to the community, given tech's explosion and the people that have benefited from this great growth. It was a fantastic conversation. Sophie and Alan are so inspiring. I really hope that you enjoy today's conversation. Sophie, Alan, such a pleasure to have both of you on today. I think it's an episode that's been a long time in the making. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about TechAide, right? And its mission and its importance. So I appreciate that both of you took time out of your very busy schedules to talk about a subject I think that's very important to all of us. Before we talk about giving back and TechAide, I want to talk about tech to start. And maybe, Sophie, première question pour toi. Si tu veux peut-être te présenter un peu ton background, ton parcours, tes années d'expérience dans le secteur de la technologie.
Oui, merci. Je suis bien contente de participer à cette discussion. Sophie Forest, je suis partner chez Brightspark Ventures. Ça fait en fait plus de 30 ans. J'ai réalisé en me mettant à calculer les années dernièrement que je suis impliquée dans la communauté tech, principalement au niveau de l'investissement chez Brightspark depuis 20 ans. Nous, on investit dans les compagnies early stage à travers le Canada. Puis on cherche des compagnies là, qui ont de la propriété intellectuelle intéressante, puis des fondateurs exceptionnels. We just closed a new fund, so that's exciting for the community. If you have companies that are trying to raise money or an interesting proposition in Canada, you should come to see us. So we're closing on a $120 million fund that is going to be focused on early stage companies again. And I'm based in Montreal, but we have an office in Toronto, also Brightspark, and we really cover across Canada.
Yeah, amazing. You're obviously one of the quintessential, brands in the country. And what's wild watching you guys from afar, it's like it seems like you're just getting going, right? Like it seems like you still have so much room in front of you.
Well, maybe I can test it with you guys, but our new thing is I was there at the Spark, which is our motto 20 years ago when we started Brightspark. And then we thought it's still so relevant. I was there at the Spark because you know what? I was there at the Spark when we started Hopper, and I'm still there at the Spark when we raised this new fund. So we're playing around with that, but we think it's quite exciting because, we have young people in the team that are getting going and super excited about that also. And, it's a good reflection on your part. We're just getting started.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. And Alan, what about you? Obviously, we know each other well, but maybe a brief introduction.
Yep, I have also been in venture for quite some time. I think probably 25 years now, having started in the world of wireless investment in the 70s as a hybrid corporate VC that was started within the Microsoft family, but was investing worldwide as GSM Capital. And particularly with regard to venture and early stage in Canada, was a co-founder of Real Ventures and have been an active partner there for the last 15 years. I'm now transitioned over the last 3 years to become a board partner, which has enabled me to, I think for my one last hurrah, having turned 60 last year, we've launched a new initiative to raise a venture fund around the age tech thematic to serve the well-being and health and massive potential of the biggest demographic segment of our society, the older population. And so we're raising a fund called AgeTech Capital together with my partners Lynn Landry, Pascal Odette, and venture partner Sarah Thomas in the US.
Yeah. Obviously, of course, the focus of today's conversation is going to be about giving back and community. I want to maybe take a brief segue before we get there, and I want to like selfishly explore where we are today in the state of tech, because I think it's going to be a good kind of segue. And I think Alan, you position it as did you, Sophie, about where we are today, right? So it's like it started with like cell phones and media and like the ICT. Now it's moved to your new fund, Alan, with longevity. It seems to be infiltrating every aspect of society. So I'd like to hear from both of you. How early are we today in the state of in the tech sector, and how much more room is there for growth, right? Because I think the selfish question around this is we want to talk about giving back and its impact, right? So it's like there's so much room for the sector to go, in my view. So it's kind of incumbent also to be thinking about more than just, let's say, shareholders, board, growth, funding, but think about the broader community, right? So that's kind of the segue I want to make. But I want to hear you about how early are we, given your decades of experience in tech.
Maybe I can jump in. I think it's an interesting question because you're right. It's if you look at a time continuum in the tech industry worldwide or in Canada, I think we're just started. If you think about what Alan is doing with the aging population, a lot of research around health and new technology around that, but climate, there's so much money right now going to climate tech, and yet there's so much to do. So I think this industry is getting bigger and bigger, and technology is actually being infiltrated in every other industry. So this is becoming bigger, and a bigger part of the population is really involved with the technology, and hence the objective, and I think the desire for those people to be even more involved in the community and the ability to give back, for sure.
Yeah, just building on what you were saying, Sophie, what was, if I think back to the sort of inception of Real Ventures, and we actually started as a little pilot fund called Montreal Startup in late 2007, it was just at the advent of what it was called Web 2.0. And what's really amazing, and it's only accelerated, was there was already a sort of layer of infrastructure and open source code. And it was just allowing entrepreneurship to happen at a greater scale with less capital. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that, what's happened. There's been this sort of, it's been described as a Cambrian explosion. And you have the sort of Lego building blocks to allow a broader and broader population of entrepreneurs to come in and use, these building blocks and build on the shoulders of giants to bring their creativity to the world. And that's one of the most exciting things, whether it's been with regard to just all the different segments of the population, different ethnicities, different ages coming to play a role in driving things forward. And so I kind of agree. Although some amazing things have happened in the last 4 decades that I've been in the professional world since graduating, still seems like in the early innings and so much potential. And what I also love is the sort of socially minded impact. I think people are starting to see there's just a lot we can do for the planet, for society, for the climate, and that's also a really exciting wave that we're seeing. And I think Canada is particularly strong in.
Yeah, and I think on that, I know we're going to talk about giving back, and specifically in Canada. When I started in the venture industry, one of the biggest challenge we had is there was no ecosystem. And I remember we used to struggle. And at Brightspark in the early days, we started our own companies because we couldn't find deal flow, and we wanted to create return, and we wanted to create value, and so on. It's not the case anymore. Like, there is an ecosystem. There is successful entrepreneur. There is repeat entrepreneurs. There is experienced investors, angel investors. And so the community is there and is vibrant, and it's growing. So it's a big difference. And I think it's very promising for the future.
What do you think of the criticism that's often been given of, like we wanted flying cars, but instead we got 140 characters, kind of the classic kind of like we're only attacking problems on the surface. Obviously, I don't believe that statement personally, just because I find, to your point, Alan, it seems to be infiltrating other parts of society. Right? I believe it was you, Sophie, that said it. But what else can the tech sector do, right? Because I find it's like the low-hanging fruit has been picked to a certain extent, and now there's harder problems to solve. Maybe they'll tie into like social problems as well. But I'd like to hear you a bit on that criticism.
Yeah, just jump in. I was back at Nauman House last night, and there was a really exciting event, Pitch for Good. It's second edition. I know there was 100 people who had registered for the event, and just I was arriving at the end, and the buzz and the excitement, and just that very fact of, I think, the ecosystem again, and finding new pathways, new routes, new endeavors. it's super nourishing. I think we need to double down that in a minute when we sort of talk about the tech ecosystem and the agencies of the Centraide ecosystem and bringing those two worlds together. But I think that ecosystem both helps people start higher up the stack, as it were, and not having to build things that already exist because there's an incredible openness to sharing knowledge. But I think it also is kind of egging everybody on to think, well, what are the real problems? What are the gaps? And I think it's also creating much more efficiency in the process as to, not creating another Me Too, because suddenly that knowledge is shared and, people can just get going quicker. So I'm really excited that people are focused on things that are meaningful, and there's just a lot of commitment, I think, to causes that are meaningful. I think it's also a way of attracting talent. It's such an essential thing that you have strong purpose within your company. So all of these things seem to be coming together with some of the challenges society is facing with regard to the motivation of the founders, and then attracting the talent around to actually build something that's going to be valuable and sustainable.
Yeah, I think you put it really well. I don't have much to add to that, but to me, I always look at it also from the creativity and the out of the box perspective. So I'm thinking a lot of some technologies are really focused on what you could call small problems, like that seem like futile, but I think there is big solving, like think about Elon Musk being able to land a rocket, and I think there's big problems in the future, and just having the tech community addressing those problems, thinking out of the box and being ambitious will make a difference.
Maybe just one other element to that, Nectar. It goes back to maybe the ecosystem and the maturity of our ecosystem. We now have role models who've done some really amazing things, which I think, historically, you'd have to look south of the border, whereas no longer the case. In every major metropolitan area, we've got phenomenal founders who've done amazing things, and suddenly it seems within reach. And yes, we can do it from here. And I think that's a really important factor as well.
Yeah. And like you said, it's like if the foundation's been built, and now we're moving forward with like more harder and harder problems. And maybe let's talk about the inception of TechAide. So maybe Alan, this one's to you in terms of like the original idea and the spirit and how it came about to be.
Yeah, when I first moved to Canada, this was in the early 90s, our company, like many companies, we did deduction at source, and Centraide was, I think, the thing to do. And so I've gradually got to know Centraide over the years, became a major donor in the mid-2000s, and that gave me the privilege of actually visiting the agencies. They support 350 agencies in Greater Montreal. And it sort of reminded me of my day job, which is super inspiring to see young entrepreneurs with great ideas and to make a dent in the universe. But it was the same on many occasions visiting the leaders of these agencies. The difference being that they devoted themselves to a local neighborhood, to a specific gap in society where we weren't taking care of people with disabilities, with whatever the context was, whether there's immigrants. But they were as inspiring and as devoted and as passionate. But yet our two worlds were just completely separate. And I just thought, like, as we were discussing earlier, the power of an ecosystem, the power of connections, making more nodes in the network, there's always magic that comes out of that. So the first thought was, how could we create, those connections between, and this was sort of thinking with the Notman House and Osmo, which was all about osmosis and connecting people with that community, create more awareness of what Centraide did to sort of orchestrate all these agencies to help them raise their own game, to be the catalyst, as we are often as VCs, with as lead investors, that then pulls together a significant round. It was the same way that Centraide ends up being a catalyst for other funding sources to support these agencies. And then there was also you could discover that like many sectors, as we were discussing, still are not very technology enabled. And it's probably even more the case with regard to charities and agencies that are lean on budgets. And so there's also a thought of just how could we share insights, and there could be cross-pollination. So there's those connections, awareness, raising money for the cause, making the know-how exchange. And there was also how could we do something that would be fun for the tech system as well, to get to know each other in a different realm outside of technology, and by doing good for our community. we should come back to that whole topic of, what it means to be within, living in a community and giving back and paying it forward, which is a bigger topic. But that was the origin, and that sort of started very humbly at an event in 2016, and has continued to. We can talk how it's evolved and the sort of magic of the creativity of our community, who keep coming up with new ideas to take this to another level. So.
What about Sophie on your end? Your involvement with Centraide and TechAide more specifically. What drove you? Maybe your personal why as to why you felt it was important to give back.
Yeah, so I think for me, it really started. I mean, it's actually Alan's fault, because I participated in one of his events. Like, I'm a soccer fan. I love playing soccer, and then TechAide organized those soccer tournaments where, it's companies and VCs create teams, and it's very, it's fun, it's competitive, and then you go and you raise money for Centraide, and you do that. So I did that pre-pandemic once or twice. And then with talking with people involved in Centraide, because the way Centraide is organized, they raise money in different ways. So they raise money to large donors, which also are participated in. They raise money through events, which TechAide is organizing a lot of events and raising money. And then one of their large source of capital is raising money to individual in their companies through deducting a small amount on their paycheck, right? And it's been historically the way they've raised money. And the good news with that way of raising money is it's stable. And it's really something, I would say, quite simple for the individual to do. Like, just, okay, take $10, out of every of my paycheck. And it creates reflex, like the habit to say, I have my paycheck. I'm going to devote my paycheck to my rent, my entertainment, my grocery, whatever. And I'm going to give like a small percentage, or it could be bigger, but to giving back to the community. So I think it develops that. So while talking to the people at Centraide, I realized that the tech community in Montreal, as a percentage of the amount given back, is actually way smaller in percentage than what it represents as an economic force in Montreal. So for me, that was an awakening. I was like, oh, that makes no sense, right? Because especially in tech, where the average salary is higher, and it's the youth. And I think it's actually the promise and the challenge, because I think those young programmer in a tech company, founder, marketing person, whatever, maybe they've not been educated to that, because they usually join a small company that grows. And Centraide, it's hard to go after a company with 20 employees. So their typical donors are Bell Canada, the government of Canada, Telesystem, which is where Alan comes from, and whatever. And I remember when I worked at Bell Canada for a really short period in my career, and they were doing those campaigns. And then you were like, oh yeah, I'll give whatever. But you develop that reflex of saying, it's part of my budget, it's part of what I do. And we have not developed that in the tech community, at least in Montreal up to now. So I thought this is a great way to be able to give back. So that was my first awakening. So I got involved in last year in the side of the Centraide that is trying to raise money on deduction and corporate and so on. And we have many ideas on the way to do it. And we were able to raise some money this year, and we're going to continue next year. The second big awakening is actually very similar to what Alan said, is I visited a few of the agencies that Centraide is backing. And when I first got involved at Centraide, a lot of the people were telling me, oh my God, they're using some of their money on the admin side. And I want to take my money and give it directly to, pop on the street or whatever, or have my own initiative with my family. And when I visited Centraide, I realized it's so critical to the Montreal community because it's stable. Yes, you can decide as a family, I'm going to give $1,000, $2,000 specifically to this group in my neighborhood. And I also do that as as my contribution. But Centraide's beauty is the stability. So I met this agency and they were talking to us and everything. And somebody asked the question, what is Centraide to you? And they said it was a Hochelaga Maisonneuve, community driven, helping young family and everything. They say we have a budget of $2 million, And $500,000 comes from Centraide every year, day in, day out, it's there. All the other money we get, we don't know if we're going to get from one year to another. It pays for our rent, the stable cost that we have every year. The other stuff is all project based, and you can't survive if you have that. So it was an awakening for me. I said, it makes so much sense. We hear of all those agencies are saying, oh, we're not sure if we'll survive because we lost the government funding, because we love this. Centraide is a machine. They raise more than $65 million every year. And that money, there's a stable check that goes to all those basic organizations in Montreal that help immigrants, that help, underprivileged neighborhood and so on and so forth. And they've got that basic money. And to me, this is what we need to start. And the rest is obviously something else you can do.
Yeah, great. A few great points to unpack, Sophie. I find that on that second piece of Centraide, I almost see it like I think Alan, you said it right, like a catalyzing effect, right? Almost like I don't know if saying a VC fund, but like raising money and then being able to distribute it to the organizations, but doing that year in, year out, and having that stability. Like I mean, myself, I've seen the kind of impact that they can have in the community. And it's one that's important, and then that dovetails with your first point of there's this Cambrian explosion. The tech sector is only going to grow, so economically it should be giving more, it should be giving back, right? And it's not because a lack of willingness, it's a lack of organization, right? So I think that's kind of the reason that TechAide exists. And maybe Alan, to your point of community, right, of the ideas of that this energy that's fostered from the sector. So I wanted to hear you a little bit about the importance of community, right? When you helped launch TechAide, what was the rationale? Why did you see community as an important element?
Well, power in numbers. We just know as startups how important it is. Mentorship, being part of a broader network for insights, for market access, for funding, and just that creativity. And we've seen it so much since I think one of the first events was a poker tournament, Notman House. Immediately had our female ambassadors saying, we're not into poker. So the next thing was a games night at Google. Out of the Google games night, which turned out to be, rather than just probably 20, 30 people at the poker, there was like 100, 120 people. And out of that, Hugo came up with the idea, why don't we do an AI conference? So you just see there's that magic when people get together that they actually get exposed to what the cause is. Always have some agency representatives actually talking about what's going on in their particular neighborhood, what are the challenges they're facing. Something makes it much more tangible that in your own neck of the woods, oh my gosh, this is just a kilometer away. There's quite a different challenges of living and integration and exclusion, or just coming, all kinds of crazy things. But the community is adding to the creativity and spreading the word, because how are we actually going to move the needle here? As you said, for Centraide, there's a bit of a distribution and a reach challenge. But if we've got more grassroots awareness, of that 20-person company that within a year is a 100-person company, and then 3 years later, we're growing into what Centraide can their business model and how their process works. So that's a huge part of community.
Yeah, I think you've both seen those stories, right? You mentioned Hopper, like Radiant 6, like how many are real? Also, there's just so many of these great success stories of companies that start, the canonical 2-3 person garage startup that becomes hundreds, thousands of people, right, across the years. So it's important for at the early stages of these founders and their journeys to be able to be thinking about also giving back, right? Maybe Sophie, what do you see? Like we talk about corporate social responsibility and like a very corporate-y thing that only big companies can afford. Why should small companies be thinking about it?
Yeah, I think, and some are, and I think it's the beauty of what Alan started with TechAide. I think like it's easier for a small company to organize a soccer team, go play, and then give some money through that. But Centraide makes it quite easy, actually, if you want to, organize your employees so they can have the deduction on their pay. It's not complicated. It's more the reach. And that's why I think as a community, if we can all say, okay, let's do this and attack it, it's a question of knowing the people and making sure they take the time. You're a startup, you have 50 employees, you're busy, you're fundraising, you're trying to sell, you have so many things you want to you want to put in place, you're trying to hire and so on and so forth. And you probably think it makes a good sense to give back, but where is it in your list of priority? So I think a lot of people we've cold called a lot of companies. Obviously, we go to the ones we know it's easier. And a lot of them, nobody says, no way, I don't want to give back. They all say, yeah, makes sense, but I'm really busy and I don't have the people to do it. Like I don't have, because usually it would be somebody in finance or in HR that will take this over, this process, right? You need at least to inform the employees, you need to answer questions. So you need somebody in your shop that will take this project on and lead it. The companies, and I know Google has been amazing. This year, Hopper started participating. We've got BuzzBud that, was giving a lot. I'm not naming all of them, but, Moment Factory, a lot of them are giving, but usually it comes down to a champion in the company that decides, I'm going to do this. It's not a lot of time, and it can be actually your way of giving back being extra time that you do outside of your working hours, and you organize that. If you find that champion, everybody's behind the cause, like they want to give. And I have 3 daughters, and 2 of them work in the tech industry, and they're, young and so on. So they know I'm working on this, and both of them just got engaged really rapidly because they thought, why? Yes, it makes sense. We need to give back. So it's not a question of people don't want to give back. It's just, getting together, making sure we can talk to everybody we know, and finding those champions that are willing to organize it and put it forward. I don't know, Alan, if your experience is different there.
No, you've got to hit it nail on the head, and it's just one thing leads to another. I do think one of the thoughts around events was getting people to talk about paying it forward. It's not a subject that's easy to broach, internally, or so just making that the onboarding, the on ramp just simpler to understand what's going on in our city. Of course, we see in certain segments of the town, depending on where you are, people in the street, homeless. Some of the consequences of Quebec winter, of migration, of all kinds of challenges. But one of the amazing things of Centraide that also they do that we should mention is they really do have a map and almost a radar of where the needs are, to make sure that when they are allocating across the agencies, it really is material and it's going to have an impact. It's another sort of their value add. And then also just this coaching and best practices from one agency to another to really raise the efficiency of what's delivered. And I think, again, TechAide, we've kind of created a forum in a very approachable way, through the events, to sort of raise the awareness, to make it easy to talk about. Because there's something that it's not obvious, but I do think there's maybe a sort of duty to give back because it's our city. And, it was one of the things we've talked about a lot when, if many of us are visiting San Francisco, and we just see the scale of the issues there. And you just do not want to let your city succumb to that. And if there's anything we can do to contribute to, the quality of life of our city where we want to live and grow our companies, I think it's a really important thing that we can do. And as you said, Sophie, it's kind of just making that an easier, more efficient, because obviously entrepreneurs and their teams are incredibly busy just trying to build, the next great thing. But I think a lot of them also want to know that they are doing something in the process for their community and for the city and for giving back. So.
Yeah, and one thing adding to that I've realized is talking to my family, about the values of giving back and what we should give. There's topics that always come back, and one of them is local. And I think, like Alan mentioned it, but it's very important. Like, we live here, we love our city, we're building value here. And Centraide Montréal, when you contribute to their activities, it's really, really local. And we do have issues here. There's issues elsewhere in the world, obviously, that you might want to contribute to, but this is like where we live and what we cherish. And to me, the other point that Alan said, I think also is very important, is they know where the needs are. Like, sometimes we see stuff, but there's so many things we don't see. Like the last agency I visited, it was like a revelation for me. Centraide has this house that they bought. So it's in Hochelaga Maisonneuve. It's a house they bought, and it's to host fathers and their kids that are homeless. And I didn't know it existed, and I thought nobody would have thought of that, but they know, because there's a lot of agency taking care of female, because sometimes they have other issues, with violence and having a child and everything. But there's actually fathers that cannot see their kids because they don't have a home, and then they lose connection with their kids, and it create so many other issues. And sometimes it's immigrants, sometimes it's people that for whatever reason ended up in the street. And I visited the dad, and I saw like the dads with the kids, and they telling us the story that sometimes after 3 months they help them, they find a place, and they reconnect with their kids. And it's such a great story long term. So that's a tiny example, but it's something I would have never thought of, as a problem that you need to solve. And they're the only ones that do that. It's the only house in Montreal where they can do that. If you want somewhere that you can go for a weekend with your kids, so you can show that you're stable and you're kind of allowed to have a relationship with your kid as a I would say a father in transit, if we can call it that way. But a lot of examples like that, so they know where the issues are.
Yeah, I think, like you both mentioned, we don't live in a bubble, right? This notion of local and communities is actually quite important, despite the remote world that we sometimes tend to be accustomed to, like we are on this call today. But it's like you wake up, you're in a physical environment, and like I said, we're lucky that, like, I found myself lucky. It wasn't this like master plan. Oh, I want to work in tech and grow in it. It's like just like kind of like I fell into it right at the right time. So yeah, there's this notion of like, hey, you're lucky. Maybe you should also think about the people that aren't as lucky, right? That grew up in different circumstances. You think just being born in Montreal, you're already like part of the 10% of the world, versus like being born in Syria, so or some other war torn country. So this notion of luck, I think, creates a duty. At least that's how I see it. And then maybe in terms of like thinking, going back to a tech company. So like, Alan, what would be ways for companies to be involved with TechAide, right? So what would be the 1, 2, 3 if you had to pitch them, right? Like here's what you need to do to be able to participate, give back. Because like you said, Centraide has this view on all the issues, right? So what an easy on-ramp to be able to like to create an impact without having to figure out your own, hey, what's important for us? Is like, hey, there's this great organization called Centraide that's already doing it.
I think number one is just getting involved. TechAide is kind of your window on what Centraide's doing in a nice, easy, approachable way. And I think that once you start to get a feel, as Sophie and I have mentioned, of just how amazing these are entrepreneurs in the social sector. They're almost our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, and just getting to know what they're doing suddenly it sort of raises your awareness and your desire to The second thing is you can become an ambassador if you really see that would like to be even more involved in animating events, coming up with ideas, just helping this build momentum, expanding our network. I want to go back to something Sophie said, because I reminded how I started. I think maybe there's a worry that if you're still a small startup and you don't have a lot of resources, and maybe salaries are not huge, even a small amount is incredibly important. And I don't feel bad about giving a small amount. I think it's just that's how I started. It was just kind of easy deduction at source. I think I just remember one of my first was maybe $38 every second pay. That's already netted. Actually, it's probably half that, because immediately the tax cuts. It's a charity, so half of that actually comes back onto your net salary. So just that starting now. There's something also powerful for you just to know that you are giving back even a little bit, and as you grow, you can kind of grow into different ways of giving back. So I think that awareness, being part of the community, there's ancillary benefits of being part of a community. As suddenly somebody that maybe also then comes back to help your business in some shape or form, and them in another way, in a more intimate relationship that just kind of breaks the barriers, and then also just starting. Even if it's $10, $20, it's all of that is just fantastic. It just kind of creates as you described it, Sophie, just
an habit.
A habit that's, I think, super important for all of us. And you do feel good about it. At the end of the day, when you look at what you accumulated, all those $10, wow, I actually probably had a big impact to somebody in my community.
Yeah.
What about you, Sophie? Any advice for founders or for teams that are thinking about it but not quite sure?
Yeah, I think we can make it very simple. So leaders and companies, if you think it would be impactful that your company get involved, you can actually contact me. Very easy. You can find me online. You can send me an email. You can call me. I'm sure you can contact Alan also, and we don't do much, but we can direct you at Centraide. One person that is in charge of tech that can help you. That's very simple. You can, and that would be step one to say, I'd love my company to do something. And then they can tell you everything you can do. And the simplest way, like Alan was saying, is, okay, have a campaign with your employees to see, can we set an objective? We're the small company, 50 employees. How much can we give back? Maybe it's $1,000. Maybe it's not much. Maybe it's $500. I don't know. But, we set an objective and we start. And then the following year, maybe you'll have, another objective. Maybe you'll participate in activities but start somewhere. Ideally, if you're the leader of the company, I would say finding a champion, because the one that have been very successful that I've seen in tech so far, they have one person in the company that really believes in it and decides to go above and beyond. So finding that champion, because as the CEO or the founder of the company, maybe it's going to be hard for you to find the time. So contact us, tell us, I want to do something. Secondly, find a champion and start simple with giving money out of the payroll. And then maybe you can go to activities or do both. But I think, and we're talking with the group at Centraide to see if we can organize bigger visits. So visiting an organization. So either yourself or somebody in your company come to one of those visits makes a huge difference. Because once you visit, you're like, oh, I can see it's very concrete what I'm doing, what I'm helping. So I really feel that money is making a difference.
Just one other thing to add, Sophie, because it was also maybe your sort of entry point into TechAide. I think events like this, we've got the AI tournament, we've got TechAide, there's going to be a new improv night this year, there's the soccer tournament, there's volleyball. I think it's also a great team building thing that's kind of already organized, that you can jump in, and it's kind of also another sort of entry point into that's good for your company. And then you get exposed to what TechAide and Centraide does. And that's another way to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, good point, Alan. Yeah, you're right. We organize so many events that I think it's, like you said, it's a great way for not just, the tech, meeting other people in the community, but for team building within your own company. And maybe a point from left field, but it's like, I think generally the tech sector, I'm a techno optimist and maybe a bit naive, but it tends to create abundance, right? So I think with enough time, it's going to alleviate a lot of poverty. It's going to raise, the standard of living across the planet. But it's going to take a long time, right? The compounding and the exponential curve is going to take a while, right? So until then, there are real issues to solve, right? Like poverty is not going to go away magically. So it needs to be tackled head on, right? And I find that's what's really cool about today's conversation is, people like yourselves are, taking time out of their very busy schedules to try and give back, to get together and have an impact. So for that, I want to thank you. It's been a super inspiring conversation. Sophie, Alan, Amy, maybe any final words of wisdom?
Well, I wanted to add to what you just said, because I think it's a great point. Sometimes we don't realize because we live in this bubble, but just think about inflation. A lot of, larger tech companies or whatever did compensate for the inflation. So a lot of the employees got raises and so on and so forth. But if you're in the poverty or you're struggling, the inflation is just hitting you in the face. Like you don't have any way to counterpart the inflation. And all of those organizations that are helping, all the neighborhoods in Montreal, for them, it's just net negative. So yes, I think tech is a positive long-term. Short-term, all those problems that we're talking about or those challenges are just way bigger than they used to be a year and 2 years ago. So even more a reason to give back and get involved.
I just reiterate what you've both said, getting together, giving back, it's good for Montreal. I also think it's really good for you. It's definitely good for your company. So highly encourage everybody to learn more and to jump on.
Great. Awesome. We'll link to everything we spoke about today in the show notes, as well as, how to connect and the websites of Centraide and TechAide. And then Sophie, Alan, just thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Nectar. Love your podcast. So thanks for doing your P&R work as well.
As always, thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. If you want to learn more, check out thepnr.com.